I'm writing this because I don't really know where else to put these thoughts, and Reddit feels like the only place where long-distance relationships are understood without immediate judgment. This is the story of how I ended up loving someone who lives hundreds of kilometers away, and how that distance became both the thing that connected us and the thing that nearly broke us. We met in the most unromantic way possible, a late-night comment thread under a random post. I replied to something she wrote, she replied back, and somehow the conversation didn't die after the usual 2 or 3 messages. We moved to private messages the same night. I remember thinking I'd talk for 10 minutes and go to sleep. Instead, we talked until the sky outside my window started turning gray. She lived in another city. At first, that detail felt irrelevant, almost theoretical. We weren't meeting, we were just talking, sharing music, complaining about work, making dumb jokes that only made sense at 2 in the morning. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people who happened to be awake at the same time and curious about each other. What surprised me was how quickly she became part of my routine. I'd wake up and check if she'd written. I'd think, I should tell her this whenever something small happened during the day. At some point, the conversation stopped feeling like chats and started feeling like a place I lived in. The moment we acknowledged it was a relationship wasn't dramatic. No big confession. Just a quiet realization that neither of us was talking to anyone else anymore, and that the idea of stopping felt wrong. We said it out loud one evening carefully, almost cautiously, knowing that distance wasn't a footnote. It was the main condition. Still, we chose to try. At the time, that choice felt simple. I didn't yet understand how heavy it would become. The first few months felt like a strange honeymoon that existed entirely through screens. We were both aware of the distance, but it hadn't fully sunk its teeth into us yet. Everything was new, so effort came naturally. Good morning messages weren't obligations. They were impulses. Staying up late wasn't sacrifice. It was excitement. We learned each other's schedules down to the smallest details. I knew when her lunch break started and which days she worked late. She knew when my mornings were chaotic and when I'd finally have time to breathe. We adapted without really discussing it, bending our days around the small windows where we overlapped. Calls became our lifeline. Video calls especially. Seeing her face, her expressions, the way she reacted before she spoke, it made the distance feel thinner, almost manageable. Sometimes we wouldn't even talk much. We'd just exist on the call together while doing our own things. It felt intimate in a quiet, domestic way, like we were practicing a life we couldn't quite have yet. But even early on, there were moments when the separation reminded me it was real. Watching couples walk past me in the city. Seeing friends post photos from spontaneous dates. Those moments didn't make me doubt her, but they made me aware of what I was missing physically. I couldn't reach out and touch her. I couldn't show up unannounced. Everything required planning. Still, I told myself this was normal. That this was just what long-distance relationships were like in the beginning. And for a while, belief was enough to carry us. As the novelty settled, we started building something more structured, almost without noticing. Our relationship developed a rhythm shaped by alarms, time zones, and shared habits that only made sense to us. Sunday evenings became our time. Short voice messages replaced long texts on busy days. We learned which silences were comfortable and which meant something was wrong. There was a strange intimacy in narrating our lives to each other. I told her about the smell of my morning coffee, the way the street outside my apartment sounded at night, the coworker she'd never meet but somehow knew well. She did the same. Through words and pictures, we built mental maps of each other's worlds. At the same time, the distance demanded a level of trust I'd never had to practice before. I couldn't verify anything with my own eyes. If she said she was tired, I believed her. If I said I needed space for an evening, she had to accept it without knowing what I was actually doing. That trust felt fragile and powerful at the same time. There were days when everything aligned perfectly, and I felt incredibly lucky. Other days, the effort behind every interaction became more visible. Planning calls around to busy lives wasn't romantic, it was logistical. Love started to look less like a feeling and more like a series of decisions. I didn't mind that, not yet. I thought maturity in a relationship meant exactly this, choosing each other even when it wasn't effortless. I just didn't realize how exhausting constant choosing could become. At some point, The distance stopped being a background fact and started becoming the main character. It wasn't triggered by a single argument or event. It was more like a slow accumulation of small frustrations that didn't seem important on their own, but weighed heavily together. There were days when our schedules simply refused to line up. I'd finally be free when she was already exhausted. She'd have energy when I was buried in work or emotionally drained. Messages became shorter, less expressive, not because we cared less, but because we had less left to give. I started noticing how often I said, "I wish you were here." At first, it was romantic. Later, it became a quiet ache. There were moments when something happened, good or bad, and my first instinct was to turn to her, only to remember that sharing it would require typing, waiting, and hoping she was available. The hardest part was the lack of physical reassurance. In a regular relationship, a hug can fix what words can't. In ours, every emotional repair had to be verbalized, explained, and carefully received. There was no shortcut. We talked about it, of course. We always talked. But talking about distance doesn't make it disappear. It just names the thing that's already hurting. And once it had a name, I couldn't ignore it anymore. What made the distance harder wasn't just geography. It was timing. We were both trying to build our lives at the same time, in different cities, under different pressures. Work deadlines, family obligations, unexpected stress, none of it paused just because we were in a relationship. Some nights, one of us would say, "I'm too tired to talk," and the other would say, "It's okay," while secretly feeling disappointed. Not angry, just quietly sad. Those were the moments when distance felt unfair, like an extra obstacle neither of us had signed up for consciously. I started to feel guilty for wanting more of her time. She felt guilty for not always being able to give it. That guilt sat between us during conversations, unspoken but present. We reassured each other constantly, sometimes so much that the reassurance itself became exhausting. We weren't fighting. That was the strange part. From the outside, everything looked stable. But internally, I could feel the relationship demanding more emotional energy than I sometimes had available. Loving her was easy. Maintaining the connection across distance and exhaustion was not. And yet, every time I thought, "This is too hard," I also thought, "But she's worth it." That contradiction became my daily emotional state. The misunderstandings didn't start as explosions. They started as pauses. Delayed replies. Messages read but unanswered. Slightly different tones that could be interpreted a dozen ways depending on mood and insecurity. I remember one specific night when she took hours to reply after I'd sent something vulnerable. By the time she answered, I had already built a narrative in my head. She was pulling away. I was too much. Maybe she was reconsidering everything. In reality, she'd been stuck dealing with something stressful and hadn't had the emotional capacity to respond properly. But the damage was already done. I replied colder than I intended. She noticed. She asked what was wrong. I said, "Nothing," because explaining felt harder than staying quiet. That was our first real mistake, assuming silence was safer than honesty. Distance amplifies uncertainty. When you can't see someone's face or hear their voice immediately, your mind fills in the blanks. And the mind, especially when tired or scared, is not kind. Small issues became symbolic. A missed call felt like rejection. A short message felt like disinterest. We talked through most of it eventually, but not without friction. Each misunderstanding left a faint residue, a reminder that even when intentions were good, execution could still hurt. Our first real conflict felt unreal, like arguing through glass. There was no raised voice, no dramatic exit. Just long messages, carefully worded, and still somehow sharp. We were both trying to be fair, to be understood, and that effort made everything heavier. What hurt most was the delay. I'd send a message explaining how I felt, then wait. Minutes stretched into hours. During that waiting, my emotions didn't freeze, they spiraled. By the time her reply came, I was no longer responding to her words, but to everything I'd imagined in the silence. In person, conflict has a physical end. Someone reaches out. Someone sighs and softens. At a distance, resolution is abstract. You don't know when it's over. You just notice that the tension has slowly faded, like background noise you eventually stop hearing. We resolved that argument, technically. Apologies were exchanged. Understanding was reached. But I realized something uncomfortable. Long-distance conflict doesn't end cleanly. It lingers in memory because there's no physical reset, no shared space to return to. That realization scared me more than the argument itself. After that conflict, something shifted in both of us. Not in a dramatic, irreversible way, but in a cautious one. We became more aware of how easily things could go wrong, and that awareness made us either retreat or lean in. We consciously chose to lean in. We started naming things before they turned into problems. If one of us felt off, we said it early, even if we didn't fully understand it yet. I'm not upset with you. I'm just overwhelmed. I might sound distant today. But it's not about us. Those clarifications didn't fix everything. But they reduced the damage caused by guessing. Support became more intentional. We celebrated small victories harder because we couldn't be there physically. A good day at work. A finished project. Even just surviving a rough week. We learned to show care through consistency, checking in, remembering details, following up on things that mattered to the other person. Sometimes support looked like giving space instead of demanding closeness. That was harder for me. My instinct was always to talk things through immediately, but I learned that love doesn't always mean access. Sometimes it means patience. We weren't perfect at it. We still stumbled. But there was comfort in knowing we were both trying, consciously, to protect what we had rather than letting distance slowly erode it. At some point, conversations about the future became unavoidable. Not because we wanted to rush things, but because distance demands direction. You can't just exist indefinitely in "we'll see." Eventually, someone asks, "Where is this going?" Those talks were both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because we were on the same page about wanting a future together. Terrifying because every plan came with conditions: jobs, money, timing, family expectations. Nothing was simple or immediate. Sometimes it felt like we were planning a life for two versions of ourselves that didn't yet exist. We spoke in hypotheticals. If I can transfer, if you can move, if things line up. Each have carried hope and uncertainty in equal measure. There were moments when I worried we were talking about the future to compensate for the lack of a present. That we were building castles in words because we couldn't build anything tangible yet. I didn't voice that fear right away. I didn't want to sound like I was doubting us, but the truth is, planning the future while living apart made time feel heavier. Every month that passed without progress felt louder than the ones before it. Our first in-person meeting had been planned for weeks, yet it still felt unreal when it finally happened. Seeing her walk toward me was both familiar and entirely new. I recognized her instantly, but my body didn't know what to do with the fact that she was actually there. The relief was immediate. So many doubts disappeared in the first few minutes. Her laugh sounded the same. The way she listened, the way she reacted, it was all real, tangible. For a while, it felt like we'd solved the hardest problem just by standing in the same place, but that meeting was also a reality check. Being together in person was incredible, but it highlighted everything we were missing when we were apart. Simple things: walking side by side, sharing meals, sitting in silence felt disproportionately meaningful because we knew how temporary they were. When the visit ended, the goodbye was worse than I expected. It wasn't dramatic, just heavy. I went back to my city carrying both reassurance and grief. Reassurance that what we had was real. Grief because now I knew exactly what the distance was taking from us. That trip made one thing clear. Visits didn't solve the distance. They reminded us why it mattered. The weeks after the visit were strangely harder than the weeks before it. Before, I missed an idea of her. After, I missed her presence: specific, physical, undeniable. My apartment felt quieter. Calls felt flatter. Screens suddenly felt like poor substitutes instead of miracles. We both struggled with readjustment. There was a brief period where we talked less, not because anything was wrong, but because we were processing the same loss in parallel. We reassured each other again, naming the sadness so it wouldn't turn into suspicion. I realized then that long-distance relationships don't just require emotional endurance. They require repeated grieving. Every visit ends in a small loss. You don't just miss the person, you miss the version of yourself that exists when they're near. That understanding made me more empathetic toward both of us. We weren't becoming distant. We were recovering. As time went on, a quieter fear settled in. Not that we'd have a dramatic breakup, but that we'd slowly wear each other down. That one day the effort would outweigh the love, and neither of us would know exactly when the balance tipped. I worried about becoming a burden. She worried about holding me back. We talked about these fears carefully, almost academically, as if analyzing them would keep them from becoming real. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The hardest part was accepting that love alone wasn't the only variable. Circumstances mattered. Timing mattered. And no amount of sincerity could fully control those things. Still, neither of us wanted to be the one who stopped trying first. Not out of pride, but out of respect for what we'd built. Over time, I had to redefine my understanding of commitment. It wasn't about constant availability or perfect communication. It was about reliability, about showing up emotionally, even when physically absent. Commitment looked like answering difficult questions honestly. Like admitting when I was scared instead of pretending to be strong. Like choosing calm explanations over reactive messages when something hurt. I stopped measuring the relationship by how easy it felt and started measuring it by how intentionally we treated each other. That shift didn't remove the difficulty, but it gave it meaning. Distance forced us to be deliberate. Nothing was automatic. And strangely, that made some parts of our connection deeper than any relationship I'd had before. Eventually, we learned to hold hope more carefully. Not as blind optimism, but as something grounded. We continued to plan, but we also acknowledged uncertainty openly. That honesty felt safer than pretending everything would work out effortlessly. Visits became anchors. Not solutions, but reminders. Proof that what we were doing wasn't imaginary. Each meeting reinforced the same truth. We were compatible, connected, and very much in love. At the same time, we accepted that love didn't guarantee an outcome. It only justified the attempt. That acceptance was painful, but it reduced the pressure we'd been putting on each other. We stopped asking, "Will this work for sure?" and started asking, "Is this still worth it right now?" For both of us, the answer remained yes. This relationship taught me that longing can coexist with gratitude. That joy doesn't disappear just because it's incomplete. And that loving someone from afar requires a level of self-awareness most relationships never demand. I learned how easily assumptions can become enemies, and how essential clarity is when you don't share a physical space. I learned that effort isn't a sign something is wrong, it's often a sign that something matters. Most importantly, I learned that long-distance love isn't weaker than other kinds of love. It's simply exposed. Every flaw, every fear, every intention is visible because there's nowhere to hide behind routine or proximity. I don't know how our story will end, but I know this: loving her changed how I understand relationships, communication, and myself. And regardless of the outcome, that lesson will stay with me.